Hello and welcome to episode 30 of Northpointe Plus. We're in the 30s.
You're counting.
Someone's counting.
That's cool.
I could just start making up numbers at this point. Who cares at this point? Yeah. Episode 30, episode 85.
Someone cares.
Someone out there is religiously following along.
They'll call us out. Yeah.
Speaking of calling out.
Hey.
So in your message, we're just going to cover this right before we get to the questions. You talked about basements.
Basements in Michigan being kind of like the upper rooms in...
And what we did not realize is that that's a really touchy topic for people because...
And I apologize for triggering some folks, apparently.
Michigan basements are a technical thing.
Apparently that's a proper noun with a capital M and then a capital B, maybe?
I think so.
Michigan basement, yeah.
Yes.
Well, thanks for letting me know.
Now we know. The more you know. We'll have that star fly across.
Yeah, there was a little paragraph we got about it being wet and dank and terrifying to children or something like that. 5 feet high and made of dirt.
Which I would wager all basements are terrifying to children. I remember being a kid, turning the lights off in my basement and sprinting up the stairs as fast as I could.
Okay.
So that the darkness wouldn't catch me.
We didn't really have basements in California. I'm sure someone does in California. Some of them preppers out in the hills.
Someone
but
out there.
Growing up in California, no basements. So this is new to us. And now it's also new to me that apparently there's a thing called a Michigan basement, when in reality I meant to refer to most basements in Michigan. First house we lived in Michigan had a basement, not a Michigan basement, but a basement in Michigan. And it ran the entire length of the house. It was tremendous. It was like a house below a house.
Yeah.
But there was this one section, you'd go into this room, and then you'd go into this door, and it was a smaller room, and then you'd go in through a smaller door into a smaller room, and it was much like Alice Through the Looking Glass.
Oh, yeah.
It was because then you got into I guess it's the well room. I don't know. It had a well in there, and it was drippy water. It was terrifying. And I thought the hobbits lived there, but they
did.
They might have at one point.
The world may never know.
Thanks, whoever put that out there. Thanks for the information. I feel smarter already.
Great. Well, now we can get to it. This is our podcast. This is our
not just a hat holder. It's getting bigger.
It holds everything.
Smart. Yeah. All right.
It's got to contain something. Welcome to our follow-up podcast. We gather together every Sunday, and then this podcast allows us to continue the conversation about Michigan basements and other such things.
Yes.
Which is fun.
Yeah.
You guys submit questions. We attempt to work our way through them as best we can. So we're in the middle, kind of. Maybe we're towards the end of our series called Jesus Is. You talked about this in your message yesterday. We've talked about Jesus having power over death, or Jesus is power over death. Jesus is worthy. Jesus is king. And now we get to Jesus is the Lamb. And so that's what you talked about yesterday. Yeah. Why does Jesus want to talk about himself as a weak old sheep?
Yeah, I don't know. That's why I talked about it. I was having some fun trying to figure that out myself. So, I mean, again, if you listen to the sermon, then the piece is that Jesus took on this picture that Jews would have understood really, really well, a lamb that needed to be sacrificed. For them, thousands of lambs over thousands of years to continue the cycle of making right-ish the relationship between them and God, but never fully right because it required constant sacrifice. In Romans and Galatians, if you want to dig into this, tons of great stuff on how this played out. But Jesus then becomes the once-for-all last lamb sacrifice. Yeah. So little known fact, Normie, if you got that is. It's interesting because not all cultures resonate with the imagery of a lamb the same.
Right.
So it worked for Jews. It works for Americans because we look at lambs as sort of, cuddly,
pure,
innocent, and we have an affection to them.
Yep.
But other places don't. And so as Bible translators, we might have talked about this in another podcast. I feel like we did. But Bible translators will often try to figure out what animal most closely represents or makes that culture feel the same.
Sure.
So that's just interesting. And I forget which culture it is, but they use the phrase pig lamb. So Jesus is the pig lamb because that culture calls every animal a pig and then some other
interesting
phrase or whatever. Yeah, I mean, I read it on the internet, so it has to be true.
It must be true.
But yeah, so that's just fascinating.
That is interesting. That would be offensive to some people, you would think.
Yeah, very.
But to that culture, fits well.
Yeah, so anyways, that's pointless. But there you go. Now your head is now not just a hat
Now
holder.
We're all learning. We got Michigan basements and pig lambs.
Pig lambs, it's a good day.
It's all good.
Yeah.
Oh, man. Okay, so we got a few questions that we wanted to work through.
Yeah.
And so one of them is about communion. We're talking about Jesus identifies himself as the lamb at this Last Supper.
Yeah.
And you spent some time going over the Passover, the significance of what Passover is, and then Jesus tells his followers, do this in remembrance of me, take the bread, take the wine. And so that's something that Christians have done for
thousands of
years now at this point. And so someone asked the question, which I thought it's appropriate. It's a good question. What does taking communion actually do? Like, does it do anything for us?
Yeah.
When I take the bread and I take the wine, is there something that happens?
Yeah.
Why do we do that?
It's a great question. I think it's a great question. And it's fun because, theologians have been debating this for also thousands of years.
Right.
So, and it's fun because it's just you and me. So now apparently we get to make a statement that says Northpointe says.
This is exactly what we think.
It's a lot of pressure right now. So just to maybe round out the conversation, some religious leanings like our Catholic brothers and sisters would say that when you take communion, it literally turns into the body. The bread literally turns into the body, the physical flesh of Jesus, and the blood turns into the literal blood of Jesus. And so if you have an experience in Catholic churches, you'll notice that's why you don't chew it, because that would be disrespectful to chew Jesus's body. But and it's also why you don't touch it. Only the priest touches it and puts it in your mouth. So so there's a whole thing. I don't think that. There's no reason to think that in Scripture. That comes from Catholic theology, and that's tradition. It's fine. But we wouldn't necessarily say that. The other side of the spectrum then would be folks who say, well, it really is nothing more than just a symbolic act.
Right.
That's it. It's just a symbolic.
Juice.
It's just grape
old
juice,
bread,
just cracker or bread. Yeah. But there's nothing more to it than just the symbol.
Right.
And I would say, I'm just left of that.
Yeah.
Because I think it's more than a symbol, because Jesus makes more of it than just merely a symbol.
Right.
But I, nowhere near the other end of the spectrum that says it's somehow. I mean, our Lutheran, I grew up Lutheran. Our Lutheran brothers say that it spiritually turns into the body and the blood, and I don't even know how to wrap my head around what that would look like. But I would say I'm right of that and left of the it's just a symbol if you're thinking of a spectrum. Because we do see some interesting pictures. Not only is it commanded by Jesus, right? So it's something that we ought to do just out of obedience, if for no other reason. Jesus only commands really two sacraments, which is baptism and communion. You could make an argument that he also modeled foot washing, but very few people make that argument. So communion and baptism for sure, things that we should do because out of obedience. There is some reality that it marks us as Christ followers. It is a unique thing that only Christians do. So that's important. I think there's a unity concept in it. It defines, it helps us physically practice unity between us and Christ, but also with each other as we do that as a group. That's why communion ought to be done, I think, in a group setting. Not that it's wrong to do it with your family or by yourself. That's fine occasionally, but I think typically we want to do that with other Christ followers, with other believers, and it is certainly a mark of the church. So as we think of what constitutes a church, communion is one of those pieces. So if you're part of a group that calls itself a church and doesn't practice communion at all, I think that would be a question mark. I say that the end of the spectrum where it's just a symbol and I'm just left of that. And we get this interesting thing in 1 Corinthians chapter I think 11, where there's something going on in the church in Corinth. There's lots of problems going on in the church of Corinth.
This is one of them.
And Paul has to address some of these issues. And so one issue was the issue of communion. So when that church came together, now they were a little more, at that time, communion was more of a meal as well. Now we really just have this, the bread and the juice. We kind of do it as a moment, but they would make a thing out of it. And so the rich people who got off work earlier would show up first. They would consume everything, including the elements. And then the poor people would get there later and there'd be nothing left for them. Rich people are getting drunk and fat because they can get there early. Poor people, they weren't, having anything, no way to participate. And Paul was ticked. He's like, this is just unacceptable. And so he writes into that. And in the end of kind of his calling them out in a harsh way, it's pretty harsh, he says, that's why some of you, because you're taking this inappropriately, you're not even thinking about what's going on, you've not considered your heart at all. He said, that's why some of you are sick and weak and dying. So Paul makes this claim that because you're taking communion inappropriately or engaging in that process inappropriately, that there's some element of, I want to be careful here, God's judgment that's flowing down on that. Now, I want to be really careful. I don't think that, like, if you're not sure, like, where you're at with Jesus or, you have sin that you haven't figured out yet, that somehow if you take communion, you're going to die.
Lightning strike.
I don't think that's probably, God can do whatever God wants to do, and I hesitate to ever say God won't, because, but just knowing that was going on in the Church of Corinth, a problem for them at that time that Paul addressed because some of them were getting sick and weak because of their their wicked approach to this important concept.
Yep.
I don't know if that plays immediately into our culture, like, oh, we're also going to have the same problems.
Right.
But I want to say that it elevates communion and the importance of it. Is that making sense?
Yeah, I think that I was going to bring up the same passage in 1 Corinthians, that clearly communion is important enough to go beyond just this is a run-of-the-mill, check-the-list symbol that we do. We just go through the motions, take the bread, take the wine. Right. There's really nothing that happens here.
Right.
Because it's important enough for God to, I think Paul says, like, God is disciplining the church because you're not taking this seriously. You're not really understanding what's going on here. You're abusing power. You're not really understanding. So
caring for each other. You're not thinking about it.
It's important enough for God to emphasize it through, hey, you're getting sick. Right. And some of you are dying because of this specific thing.
Yeah. Which I think is and this is, I haven't spent the time studying, so I'm out on a real thin limb here, but I think this is the only thing in terms of what we think about when we practice, when we worship together, that has this depth of seriousness to it. I can't think of anywhere in the scriptures, for example, that says somebody died because they sang wrong.
Yeah.
Or
you might be able to say like giving with Ananias and Sapphira.
Yeah, fair. Yep. Okay.
Like they lied about their giving, and so that was important enough.
Yeah.
So, but again, it's not the specific action of it.
Right.
It's the heart behind it.
Yeah,
like,
absolutely.
There are plenty of people that have lied about their giving or have overemphasized or have exaggerated. That is a serious thing, but they're still alive. They're still walking around. Because thankfully God doesn't hold.
Yeah. Well, that whole new covenant is grace-based. The old covenant was much more. And so as you approach communion, today in our modern times, I would suggest that we do take it with an element of seriousness. Yeah. That we walk into that going, hey, where am I right now with Jesus? Am I good, or is there some business that I should do? Yeah. Do I know Jesus? And so, like, if you're watching this and you don't have a relationship with Jesus, I don't think communion is for you. And that's okay. Like, that's not a big deal. I mean, it's a big deal, but it's not like, oh my gosh, everyone's going to look at you weird because you're not taking communion. It's okay to let that pass until you come to some clarity on your relationship with Jesus. And the more important piece there would be, let's talk and let's figure out the relationship with Jesus, because that's the eternal significant piece. Right. So,
Yeah, that's great. I think the level of importance is very important and can often be, I don't want to say overemphasized.
Sure.
But if you look through church history, like one of the most famous splits in church history comes from a disagreement on communion with Martin Luther and
the other guy.
The guy before John Calvin.
Yeah.
Whoever it was. Zwingli. Zwingli's his name. I think it was Zwingli. Maybe it was Calvin.
Let's go with it.
Who cares?
Yeah.
But they were so adamantly opposed to each other's views on just communion, and their specific view was, I think Martin Luther believed that Jesus was physically present somehow in communion, and Calvin or Zwingli were like, that's impossible. Yeah. And so they were like, well, bye, we'll start another church. Yeah. And that would be a disagreement where we would say,
let's not get into the weeds on that. Yeah.
Stop that.
Yeah.
The importance is that you're taking communion, and you can have those disagreements. It's not saying you shouldn't disagree on it.
And we take it seriously, and we use it as an opportunity to consider what's going on in my heart and celebrate the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. I mean, that's the whole point of the commemoration of that that practice.
Yes.
Is so that we're consistently reminding ourselves of what Jesus did for me, which ought to cause me some kind of reaction.
Right.
Like, oh, thank you, Jesus. Don't know what you were thinking looking at a guy like me, but man, I'm so thankful of it. So,
love it. Great stuff.
Oh, amen. We should pray and be done. I was like, I almost started preaching again. It's my bad. I'm sorry.
All right, next question. Yeah. And this goes along the lines with, how should we take communion seriously? So we've talked about this is a really serious thing. If you're not doing it in the right way in terms of, having that right relationship with God, people were getting sick, people were dying. So someone asked the question, does communion need to be taken like Jesus gave it, where you have the bread like the bread that Jesus
gave? The unleavened cracker?
Unleavened.
Yes.
And do you have actual wine? And is that an important piece that we're missing in communion, that we don't have that specific element?
So you'll like my non-answer, because no, I don't think that it has to be the exact unleavened bread made by Jewish hands and some element of whatever wine looked like back in 30 AD, because I don't know what wine looked like. You got some disagreement on how much alcohol content that wine had in it, so I don't know. But I do think no, it doesn't have to be those specifics, but I do think there's a kooky end too.
Sure.
So if you're like taking it with milk and Cheerios, maybe Cheerios are actually close. If you're taking it with like
every morning with my cereal,
with milk and a bucket of chicken, I don't know. There's probably some reverence that gets lost somewhere in there. And so I don't know that anybody would realistically do that and think. I mean, some youth pastors probably somewhere are
has
doing
done
that, but
Mountain Dew and pizza.
yeah, that's probably, I don't know. It just misses something because pizza doesn't represent Jesus's body. You know what I mean? I always tell people I think crackers are a great way to go. I mean, I like real bread because I think that's better, but crackers are a fun way to go because every cracker that's ever made has stripes on it because that's how they cook. And then there's holes in it. And it makes us think of the Isaiah passage. It talks about, by my stripes I'll be healed, by his wounds or pierced with wounds. Transgressions.
Yeah.
And so there's something really, again, becomes even more meaningful symbolically.
Sure.
And again, whatever the juice looks like, I think if you're taking it like with just water, which is fine. I mean, the whole point is what's going on in your heart. But there is something much more symbolic to a red liquid because it helps us think of blood. Whether it's grape juice or wine or whatever, I don't think that matters.
Yep. Yeah, I think we're on the same page that there's Jewish culture especially was so focused on having these intentional, visual, tangible reminders of something. So that's another, talking about what does communion do, Jesus tells us, do this in remembrance of me. So something about this should remind you, should make you think back to what has Jesus done for me.
Yeah.
Can pizza and Mountain Dew do that? Maybe, depending on the circumstances, depending on what's available, sure, that's fine. But I think there is something to, again, that's the same reason with the sacrament of baptism. There's a reason that we baptize in water with immersion, because that physical action, just the action of it, when you remove the spiritual aspect, does something to remind us.
That picture is more
the old
accurate.
is literally down and gone. It's drowned away, and the new is raised up. And something about having the bread and having the wine or the juice or the Kool-Aid. We're not going to be the church that drinks the Kool-Aid. But it's something about that. For us as human beings, has that tangible reminder that I think is important.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, maybe, and I think this works. At least it works in my head. We think of wedding rings.
Sure.
We wear wedding rings if we're married. Most people do.
Yep.
Does it have to be metal?
Yeah.
So I used to wear a metal ring, and then recently my wife and I got these silicone rings because I love them.
The best.
Oh my gosh! And I don't keep bending it up when I, do things with metal in my hands.
Yep.
So can it be? And I know people who have tattoos.
Yeah.
For ring, and that's cool too. So the point being, the ring is what helps us remember a commitment, a promise we made to another person.
Yep.
So again, in communion, I think there is something to a cracker type and a red juice liquid type
thing.
Yeah, that's a little more focused, memorable, mindful.
Good. Well, if we agree, then we've spoken.
Northpointe.
And people should be concerned.
Wow.
I'm just throwing it out.
Oh, yeah, it's fair.
Take everything with some grains of salt. Last question. And this, I think, is a great question that I think as people read through the passage that you went through in Mark yesterday, inevitably it comes up where Judas is at the table with the disciples, with Jesus. Jesus tells them, one of you is going to betray me. And eventually Judas is identified as the betrayer.
Yeah.
So why in all of that? Why is Judas one of the disciples?
Yeah.
Why is he identified as one of the betrayers and he's allowed to leave? Why don't the disciples stop him? Why doesn't Jesus stop him? This could have been so easy to avoid. Why is Judas allowed to walk free? It's
interesting you use the word avoid because then it'll just shape my answer because Jesus didn't want to avoid what was coming. So, Jesus certainly knew that he was down to the end of his life. He certainly knew that crucifixion was coming.
Yep.
I would suggest he knew Judas was a traitor all along. That's kind of what I think.
Yeah.
And yet that blows your brain a little bit because he allows Judas to still have access to him for those years.
Yeah.
Close out of a heart for a love for people, even though knowing. And so, same Jesus today knows our stuff and yet gives us this ability to have closeness to him if we enter into that.
Yeah.
It's pretty cool. So I don't think Jesus wanted to avoid it. The Judas stuff had to happen, and so that there would be an arrest, so that there would be a trial, so there would be a crucifixion and a resurrection. And the other piece of that too is that there's just interesting prophecy that's fulfilled in that whole thing. So the Ezra 5, Isaiah 53, Zechariah 11, Psalm 41. You can look all this up online. I just spent a couple minutes going, hey, where were those again?
Yeah.
Because it's not stuff that's in the forefront of my mind.
Right.
But there are interesting prophecies about the Messiah being traded for 30 pieces of silver.
Yeah.
So that number is part of the prophecy. So there had to be a trader because that was going to come down.
Yeah.
That number is potentially significant in Mosaic law. The Exodus, I don't know what it is, 20, 21, talks about 30 pieces of silver is what it would require to pay if your ox gored somebody else's servant, slave.
Yeah. Okay.
So there's some connections pieces that I think keep coming back, and just a reminder that Jesus was the Messiah that he said he was. All these little components. And so while Jesus, I think, knew what was going on, I don't know that the disciples were so clear on it.
I don't think so either.
Certainly when Peter leans across the table, I think, to John and says, hey, you ask Jesus who it is, I'm out. And John leans into Jesus and says, hey, who is it? And Jesus said, it's the guy who's going to dip bread at the same time that I do. Maybe John had an inclination, because that seems like a pretty clear, but then Judas gets up and leaves.
Yep.
Because Jesus kind of says, hey, what you're going to do, go for it.
Go do it.
And it's either Matthew or Luke gives us the detail that the disciples just assumed, since he was the treasurer, he held the purse, that he was just going to buy more supplies or give to the poor. Judas, that guy, Jesus, that money guy.
Yeah.
So they just didn't think a ton of it. And it is interesting, I think, to recognize these Gospels were written after the event. Mm-hmm. They weren't written at the moment the event happened, so they were written some years later, and so they are reflecting back in. And so when John makes it clear that it was Judas, well, that's, some years down the road, he had clarity on the whole picture. In the moment, I really do see that dinner as kind of a 12 guys eating at the same time together, with all that would be going on with 12 guys, and the bickering and the confusion and the I'll die for you. Oh my gosh. Right. So kind of all that stuff that plays in there.
Yeah. And I think, especially when you look back, if you look through the disciples' eyes as they tell their own story, which again, I think we've talked about this in another podcast, speaks to the validity of what they're talking about, because they keep on sharing moments where it's like, hey, we were really dumb right here in this moment. This is a dumb thing that we did. Yeah. And all throughout the Gospels, they just misunderstand over and over and over again what Jesus is saying. They think his kingdom is a physical kingdom. They think he's coming to overthrow Rome. Yeah. He keeps saying that he's going to die, and they're like,
no, you won't. We'll protect you.
That can't be possible.
Right.
He must be mistaken. And so I think in that moment when Jesus and Judas are having that interaction, I think the disciples are like,
yeah. Well, and it's just,
I don't know.
Just think proximity. It's a long table, there's guys at the other end having their own conversation about who's more important. Yeah. And John is kind of leaning into Jesus like, hey, who is he? He's like, it's that guy over there. Yeah. And Jesus is like, oh, snap. Yeah, just take off. Okay. I mean, that's so here's a freebie. This is freebie just for podcast listeners. All right. I don't things that I'm not sure of, I'm not going to really talk about on a Sunday morning, because I think there's that's just good preaching. But there are some things that can be curious. And so this is free, just for podcasts, so no one else is getting this. Kind of cool. This is just, I think it's cool because
it's an exclusive.
Yeah, it's exclusive. Oh, that's what the little splash is going to look like on the screen. There is a real possibility that the upper room that they met in was actually Mark's parents' house. Oh. This is a thought. It may not be, but not Mark, by the way, but Mark the apostle. So Mark writes a gospel, but we know Mark writes his gospel from the perspective of other people, probably Peter, because Mark was probably just a kid when Jesus was walking around in the years that he was doing ministry. Yep. We have this idea that I forget which guy, I think it is in Mark, when Jesus is arrested, and it says that one of the guards reaches out and grabs this kid's cloak, and he takes off and he runs away naked, basically. That's probably Mark. Yeah. And so if you work back from that, again, theory, okay? Don't take this to the bank, but it becomes interesting, and I think it's plausible. If that's Mark in the garden in that moment, why is he only wearing his underrobe, Well, and it's possible that, back it up to the front side, as Jesus tells the guys to go in, find a dude carrying water, follow him to a house, and say, hey, we're going to have our Passover here. Well, that could have been Mark's house. Jesus and his crew would have been known to Mark and his parents, because Mark's kind of chasing after him like maybe a 15-year-old kid would, like, hey, what's going on here kind of thing. And so then if Mark's dad lets them, hey, I have the Passover in the upper room. Yeah. And then at some point, if Judas slips out, and let's just say that Mark is sleeping over in a corner watching what's going down, and he's like, oh, man, what's happening? Well, maybe Judas slips out to bring the soldiers, to bring the officials back to the house. to arrest Jesus because he knows where he is.
Yeah.
Well, then by the end of the bread and the wine and stuff, Jesus slips out. They sing a hymn, go to the Mount of Olives. So what if Mark had fallen asleep? What if he woke up, realized they're not there anymore, bolts out to figure out where they are to warn them, hey, I think these soldiers are coming probably because they came to the house knocking on the door saying, hey, where's Jesus? And those guys, and they're like, oh, I don't know, he took off. They sang and left and stuff.
Yeah.
Well, Mark would have known they were going out to the garden probably because it was a place Jesus often went to pray. Are you guys still tracking with this? I don't know, maybe you lost me at some point. And so Mark, just threw on whatever he had around him, ran out to warn Jesus. The soldiers show up to the house. Did Jesus leave the house intentionally to not bring the family in on that? I don't know. I'm just making that out. There's no scripture for that, but it does, man, it sounds like Jesus to me.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not going to bring Mark's dad and mom into this scenario, so let's go out, sing a song. I want to be there anyways. I want to pray for you guys, for us in the garden. So then we get the arrest scene that happens in the garden, maybe because Judas and the soldiers showed up to the house first. Jesus isn't there. Judas would have also known that, Mount of Olives, Garden of Gethsemane was a place Jesus hung out. So then he tromped them over there. We got a naked Mark who, ran out there in his underwear going, Jesus, one if by land, two if by sea, or however that worked. And then the soldiers show up and, they grab Mark and he bolts. And I don't know if any of that is accurate. There's no biblical, we can't go anywhere in the scriptures for that. We're really making up a lot.
Right.
But
there's dots there.
I don't think it's crazy, and it doesn't matter in the scheme of eternity and
doesn't change
salvation.
theology.
Not at all.
Yep.
But to me, it is interesting that that's a possibility. Yeah. There was some connection with that upper room, and it also explains potentially if that's the upper room that they were in come Acts 1 still, just trying to wait for Jesus to return on power. We're not really sure. Yeah. That makes some sense if Mark's dad's like, yeah, be here as long as you guys need to. Yeah. We get that.
Huh.
I don't know.
That's great. That's really good.
Yeah, that's free.
Thanks for the freebie.
Because we can't prove it. So, I don't know. But
again, grains of salt. Take it with some grains. But it's interesting. Yeah. For sure. Awesome. Well, that's the last question. Yeah. Is there anything else you wanted to leave people with Jesus is the Lamb?
No, just
that concept.
Just that exclusive.
Yeah.
You heard it here. You heard it here first. I stole it from someone else. That's not my own theory. So
no, made up on the spot.
Yep. Nope. That's all I got.
Good stuff. Well, thanks for your questions. Thanks for submitting questions. Be sure to continue the conversation. Like the video, share the video, keep comments going. We love having conversations with you guys. And Chris, thanks for your time.
Yeah, sure.
Appreciate it. And we'll see you guys next week.